Connor Lennon from UN News, and this is the SDG Media Zone, which this year is taking place online. And we're online, of course, because of the COVID-19 pandemic, which is having an enormous impact on societies and economies around the world. One of those impacts is a rise in hunger, and there are fears that a new wave of hunger could sweep the globe. The World Food Programme has warned of a hunger pandemic overwhelming nations already weakened by years of instability. And here to tell us more about the links between COVID-19 and hunger is Valerie Guarnieri, the WFP Assistant Executive Director. Hello, Valerie.
Hi, Connor. How are you?
Very well, thank you. I hope you're well and staying safe. Now, the World Food Programme is planning to carry out the largest food operation in history. Could you talk us through some of the main reasons that COVID-19 has increased the threat of hunger so dramatically?
Well, coming into COVID-19, we were already seeing a rise in hunger after decades of really having hunger on the run. And we've been seeing this rise because of conflict and because of climate. With COVID, what we're seeing is that hunger is being taken to even new levels, and people are feeling the hit on two fronts. On the one hand, some of the supply chain disruptions that have come from the pandemic are causing food supply in the markets to go down and food prices to go up. And at the same time, people feel the hit of the socio-economic crisis that's generated by COVID in their pockets. So families are finding it harder to find the food that they need in the markets. They're struggling to afford it. And with job losses in remittances, it's just getting even more difficult for people to buy the food necessary for themselves and for their families to survive and to thrive.
So we're talking about possibly the largest food aid operation in history. Logistically, what does that look like?
Scaling up to 138 million people reached this year is a huge operation for us and the biggest scale up in history, as you've said. And that means on the one hand, we need to mobilize the resources that we need, and we still need $5 billion in order to reach that target. We need to be buying food, pre-positioning it in the main corridors to reach the people who were affected. And then we've been really scaling up our cash assistance for households. And so there we need to be able to prime the pumps of our cash programs to ensure that people get the support that they need so that they can buy food in the markets for themselves and for their families. So it's a massive undertaking for which we need a lot more support.
And how far away are you from those funding targets?
WFP still needs $5 billion in order to meet our funding targets and get our operations up to the scale required. And this is something that we're working towards. A few months ago, we called on donor governments to advance the financing that they had already committed for the year, and many did that. And based on that, we were able to pre-position food in some of the key supply chain corridors. But what we've seen is that with COVID, the impact on hunger is really growing. And so our programs have had to scale up even further. Governments have also turned to WFP to assist them in buying the food that they need to keep their social protection systems going, or to help make those programs more effective for reaching more people. And so this requires an additional $5 billion before the end of the year for us to deliver on those promises.
And if you don't get that funding, what could the consequences be?
Well, what we found with COVID is that while no one is spared of the impact, it's the most vulnerable who suffer the most. And here we're looking at urban poor who are finding it increasingly difficult to afford the food that's in the markets. We have displaced populations and refugee populations already dependent on humanitarian assistance who are now struggling even further, and informal workers who don't have the protections in place from their jobs and from their livelihoods, who are really struggling. So for us, what's most essential is to make sure that our own urgent humanitarian programs can continue to deliver for those most vulnerable people, while assisting governments to fine-tune and refine their existing social protection systems so that those systems too can be more effective in reaching out to those most vulnerable. And if we're not able to ensure that that's in place, we really feel that nothing less than a pandemic is, and here we're talking about a hunger pandemic on top of the health pandemic, is the fate that awaits.
Now, there's a phrase that I personally came across only quite recently, this idea of food systems. And I know that the UN is trying to help more people understand and raise awareness of what systems are all about and why they're so important. There's going to be the first Food Systems Summit next year, as you know. And it seems that for many people, food systems just aren't working, are they? 2 billion people are obese, $1 trillion worth of food wasted every year, and millions still going hungry. I mean, what's the answer to this?
Well, in the simplest terms, when we're looking at food systems, we're basically talking about everything from farm to fork. And here we need to make sure that those systems and each step in that value chain is delivering for all people, delivering food security, delivering against malnutrition, and delivering effectively and efficiently and in a sustainable way for the planet as well as for the people. And here, food systems are not yet up to that task. We have a problem where we already know that the numbers of hungry are growing, and so food systems are not delivering for those furthest behind. But we also know that food systems are a huge contributor both to climate change in terms of greenhouse gas emissions and in terms of deforestation. And so we need to make sure that food systems are refined in order to effectively deliver for people and for planet. And the Secretary General has called for a food systems summit next year. And this is a great opportunity for us to align public sector, private sector, everything that needs to come into place to make sure that food systems really deliver for all.
Now, Valerie, as we're talking right now, it's the start of UNGA 2020, the start of the 75th UN General Assembly session. Lots of issues being covered, a lot of big problems, crises to deal with around the world. How confident are you that the issue of hunger is going to get the attention that it deserves?
There are a lot of issues on the agenda, and we need to fundamentally come out of the UN General Assembly with the clear action plan for the Sustainable Development Goals. How are we going to ensure that we achieve that aspiration that the world leaders signed up to? And hunger, SDG 2, is a key part of that. It's required in order for many of the other goals to be achieved, and it's also affected by progress in those other goals. So it's absolutely imperative that we come out of the General Assembly with the clear action plan and with the robust commitments and systems in place to deliver on that action plan moving forward.
Now, just yesterday, the head of the World Food Programme, with whom you work very closely, David Beasley, he addressed the Security Council, and he used some pretty stark apocalyptic language to discuss this problem, this hunger pandemic, this fear of famine sweeping the globe. Do you share his fears, and do you share that passion and frustration that we clearly saw yesterday?
As WFP Executive Director David Beasley said, We are on the verge of famine in a number of countries. And this comes as a result of conflict. It comes as a result of climate shocks, but it's also compounded and exacerbated by the effect of COVID-19. And we've seen donor nations stepping up to provide resources to support WFP programs and also partner programs that target the most vulnerable and seek to support them. But it's not enough. We now have the tools to warn of crises, to warn of famine. We have actions and programs in place that we know are effective in addressing it, but we need to step up. More needs to be done. There's huge amounts of wealth that are out there in the public sector and in the hands of very wealthy individuals. And it's really essential that all that comes together to prevent this from happening. And famine is absolutely preventable, but it requires political will and it requires financial innovation.
Now, Valerie, you and I are speaking in the United States, the richest country in the world. But even here, there are many people who are suffering food insecurity and going to bed hungry. How does that make you feel?
Well, countries like the United States have the wherewithal to ensure that no child goes to sleep hungry. And in situations like we have now, it's absolutely imperative that the US matches the broad-based macro stimulus support that they're providing with efforts to ensure that that reaches and targets those who are most vulnerable, those who are furthest behind in the country. But that's not enough. It's also essential that the US and other rich nations reach out and support those around the world whose governments don't have the wherewithal to provide that support. I think COVID has shown us almost more than anything else how connected we all are. And it's incumbent around all nations to ensure that we reach those furthest behind, we lift them out of hunger and poverty, and that we prevent these famines that we have the means to prevent.
Earlier this week, Valerie, I spoke to the head of education at UNICEF, the Children's Fund, and he was insistent on the importance of opening as many schools as possible, as safely as possible, not just for the educational aspect, but because of the many other services that schools provide for particularly vulnerable children. It can, as you know, be the only meal that they eat that day, and the consequences of having schools closed for a long period could be really catastrophic. I presume you would agree with him on those sentiments.
It's absolutely essential to get children back to school wherever it's safe for them to do so. And part of that is so that they can have access to the learning that comes through being in school and engaging directly with their teachers and their peers. But a critical part of that is also for children to access a nutritious meal. School meals are the largest global safety net, and they just provide a lifeline for children, both to ensure that their food needs are met, but also to help them benefit more from the learning. You can't learn on an empty stomach. And WFP is working very closely with UNICEF, with Education Cannot Wait, and other partners to ensure that schools reopen wherever they can, and that a nutritious school meal is an essential part of that package.
Now, Valerie, you must often have to deal with some pretty harrowing scenes, dealing with large numbers of people dying of famine, starving. It must be very tough. Is it unremittingly bleak, or are you seeing any positive signs over the years?
Well, one of the really positive signs that we've been seeing at WFP is how nations are really stepping up to ensure that their systems are catering to the most vulnerable. And we've had 50 nations who have approached the World Food Program specifically for help to ensure that their systems are adapted, their systems are more efficient, they're more effective in reaching the most vulnerable. And at the end of the day, nations are on the front line for addressing the problems, for keeping hunger and the hunger pandemic at bay. And for me, it's been really encouraging to see the number of nations who are really stepping up to do that.
Well, thank you very much for your time, Valerie. I really appreciate talking to you, and I wish you all the best with these huge, crucial operations that you're involved in, and of course, looking ahead to the Food Systems Summit next year.
Thank you, Connor, and it's really been a pleasure to talk to you today.
There's much more to come on the SDG Media Zone over the next few days, with high-profile guests discussing crucial global issues, including biodiversity, education, and the dangers of misinformation during a pandemic. Goodbye, and stay safe wherever you are.